The November light in Clover Falls does something strange to the afternoons. It comes through the kitchen window at a low angle, turning everything gold for about 20 minutes before it disappears entirely, and you're left in a gray that somehow feels colder than actual dark. I used to love that golden window. My husband Gerald called it the Lord's spotlight. Now I just pull the curtain closed before it arrives, because standing in it alone feels like being reminded of something I can't name. My name is Margaret, and I am 71 years old. I taught high school English for 34 years at Clover Falls Regional, and I can tell you that in all those years of reading stories with my students, I never once thought I would end up living one. Not this kind, anyway. I should start where it actually started, which is not the morning I went to the hospital. It started long before that. It started the way most quiet disasters start, slowly and then all at once, in the spaces between phone calls that get shorter and shorter, until one day you realize you've been doing most of the talking for 2 years. My daughter is named Renee. She lives in Phoenix with her husband Todd and their 2 boys, and she is the kind of busy that fills every room she enters. When she calls, and she does call, maybe twice a month, I can hear the other life happening behind her voice, a child asking something, a door closing, the particular silence of someone checking a screen while pretending not to. I don't blame her for it. I spent enough years watching young mothers at parent-teacher conferences do the exact same thing, their eyes drifting to the clock while I talked about their child's potential. Life pulls at you from so many directions at once. I understand that. My son is named Dennis. He is 44 years old and lives 40 minutes away from me, in a house that Gerald and I helped him and his wife Sandra buy 11 years ago. We gave them $80,000 for the down payment. I want to say that plainly, not as a complaint, just as a fact, the way you'd state the color of a wall. We gave it freely, gladly, because that is what parents do when they have it to give. Dennis thanked us with a card that had a lighthouse on the front. I still have it somewhere. Gerald died 4 years ago. A stroke, fast. The way the good ones go if there must be a good one. And after the funeral, after everyone went home, and the casseroles stopped arriving, and the sympathy cards yellowed on the mantle, I found myself in this house with the golden afternoon light and the quiet that has a texture to it when you've lived with someone for 43 years and suddenly you haven't. Dennis called more in that first year. He came over sometimes on Sundays, sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee, talked about the kids, talked about work. It felt like something was being tended to. But grief has a shelf life in other people's lives, even when it doesn't in your own. And by the second year, the Sunday visits had become monthly, and by the third year, they were something that happened at holidays and birthdays, if schedules allowed. I told myself it was fine. I am not a woman who asks for things. Gerald always said that about me, and he meant it as a compliment, though I've come to think it may be one of those compliments that contains a small, hidden wound. I told myself I had my garden, my book club, my neighbor Ruth who came over on Thursday evenings and watched those British mysteries with me. I told myself I was managing beautifully, which is what you tell yourself when managing is all you're doing. The chest pains started in September. I didn't tell anyone. That is my first confession in this story, and I make it without pride. I noticed the tightness when I climbed the stairs too fast, a kind of pressure just below my collarbone that would arrive and then leave like a rude guest. I told myself it was acid reflux. I told myself it was stress. I told myself it was the weather changing. I told myself everything except what my body was actually saying, which was, something is wrong, and you need someone to take you to a doctor. I finally went alone to see Dr. Pellman on a Tuesday in early October. He listened to my chest, looked at the results of my EKG with an expression I didn't like, and told me I needed to see a cardiologist immediately. Not in a few weeks. Immediately. The cardiologist's name was Dr. Anand, a quiet man with careful hands, and he told me after the imaging that I had a significant blockage and that I would need surgery. Not elective. Not something to think about. A triple bypass, scheduled for the following Thursday, at St. Catherine's Medical Center, 45 minutes north on the highway. I drove home by myself and sat in my car in the driveway for a long time before I went inside. I called Renee first. She answered on the 4th ring, and I could hear the Phoenix noise behind her, the brightness of it. I told her about the surgery, the Thursday date, the hospital in Clover Falls. There was a silence that I measured carefully while she processed it. Then she said, "Oh, Mom, that's really serious. Are you scared?" And I said no, which was partially true. She said she was going to talk to Todd about what they could do, what the timing looked like, and that she would call me back tomorrow. She called back 2 days later and told me that the flights were so expensive last minute, and the boys had school, and that she'd been online looking at the options, and maybe she could come the week after, once I was settled and recovering. And wouldn't that actually be more helpful anyway, having someone there for the recovery rather than just the surgery itself? I told her that sounded like a fine plan. I wrote down her reasoning in my mind and I folded it away somewhere I could find it later. I called Dennis that same evening. He lives 40 minutes away. 40 minutes on the highway, past the farm stands and the water tower with the peeling flag painted on it that Gerald always said they should fix. I told him the same things I told Renee. Surgery Thursday. St. Catherine's. Triple bypass. The silence on his end was different, not processing. More like searching. He said, "That's a big deal, Mom." I agreed that it was. He said Sandra had taken on extra shifts at the clinic and he had a project deadline, and the kids had a lot going on. And then he said he'd try to come if he could manage it. And I should let him know how it went. Let him know how it went. I want to stay with that sentence for a moment, because I have turned it over many times since. Let him know how it went, as though a mother's open-heart surgery is the kind of thing you check in on after the fact, like a dinner reservation or a job interview. I don't think he meant it coldly. I have spent a great deal of time trying to believe that. But there is a difference between what people mean and what their words do to you at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night when you are sitting alone in a house you've lived in for 37 years and you are genuinely frightened and you needed someone to say, "I'll be there, Mom. I'm coming." Neither of them said it. The morning of the surgery, I drove myself to St. Catherine's. I had arranged for a neighbor to pick me up afterward, a woman named Carol from my book club, who made no fuss about it and simply appeared in the parking lot when I texted her. But I drove myself there in the dark at 5:30 in the morning with a small overnight bag on the passenger seat, and I want to tell you that I was composed, because I was. But composed is not the same as fine. Composed is what you are when you don't have another choice. The intake nurse was a young woman with dark braids named Yolanda, and when she got to the emergency contact section of my paperwork and I paused slightly before answering, she looked up at me with the kind of attention that nurses develop over years, a listening that goes beyond the clipboard. I gave her Dennis's number, because he was local. When she asked if anyone would be coming in to wait during the surgery, I said no. My family lived out of state. It was almost true. Yolanda didn't make a face. She just nodded and wrote something down and then looked back up at me and said, "We're going to take very good care of you." Something in the way she said it told me she understood more than she was acknowledging, and I was grateful for her discretion. The surgery went well. Dr. Anand came to speak with me when I was alert enough to have the conversation, and he told me everything had gone as hoped and that I was, in his words, a remarkably strong woman. I told him I had been told that before, and it had never made anything easier. He smiled at that, a real smile, and patted my hand once before he left. I was in the hospital for 4 days. Renee called each evening, and the calls were kind and genuine and about 15 minutes long. Dennis called once, on the second day, and the call was 7 minutes. I know because I looked at my phone afterward the way you look at evidence. He said he was relieved I was okay, that he'd been worried, and that Sandra sent her love. I said thank you for calling. That was the whole of it. On the third day, something happened that I did not expect. Yolanda was not my nurse that day. I had a different nurse in the morning rotation, but she came by in the afternoon, off shift from what I could tell by her street clothes, carrying a paperback and a small container of soup from the cafeteria. She set them on my tray table and said, "I thought you might like something other than the menu." Then she sat down in the chair by the window and said she had an hour before she needed to leave, and asked if I wanted company. I said yes before I had finished thinking about whether to say it. We talked about books. I taught English for 34 years and I have opinions, and Yolanda had opinions right back, and for an hour I did not think once about the surgery or my children or the quiet house waiting for me in Clover Falls. When she got up to leave, she said she was working my floor again Saturday and would stop by. I said I'd probably be discharged by then. She said, "Then I'll come Friday." And she did. I don't know how to explain what it means when a stranger gives you uncomplicated kindness at the exact moment your family has demonstrated complicated absence. I kept thinking about something I used to tell my students when we read about characters who got their values wrong. The people who show up for you reveal the truth about the people who don't. Carol drove me home on Saturday. My house was exactly as I had left it, cold and quiet and full of the smell of the candles I burn in the evenings. Carol put some groceries in the refrigerator and checked that the heat was working and said to call her if I needed anything, and I said I would. She left, and I stood in my kitchen in the November light, and I made myself a decision. I was going to go through the house. I want to explain what I mean by that. After Gerald died, I went through his things slowly, the way you do, touching each item and deciding what it was. Keepsake, donation, the particular grief of something with no category. But I had not gone through the papers, the financial papers, the documents in the fireproof box in the closet, and the folders in the filing cabinet in Gerald's old office. I had been paying bills and maintaining accounts the way a person does mechanically, because the mechanics of life insist on continuing. But I had not looked at everything. I had not looked carefully. This is what I found. 3 years ago, Dennis had come to me asking about the house. My house, the house Gerald and I built in 1989, the house on Maple Creek Drive with the porch. Gerald added himself one summer, and the garden I've tended for 30 years. Dennis had come to me and said that he and Sandra were having a rough patch financially, that the business was slow, and could he use the house as collateral for a business loan, just temporarily, just to get through a hard quarter. Just paperwork, really. Just a formality. I won't even need to use it. Mom, it's just to show the bank the asset. Nothing will happen to the house. And I, trusting my son the way mothers trust their sons, had signed the papers he put in front of me. I had not read them carefully enough. I had not had a lawyer look at them. I had signed because he asked me and because I did not think my son would ever put my home at risk. What I found in the filing cabinet, tucked behind a folder labeled Insurance, was a document I had never seen, a loan agreement, in Dennis's name, for $320,000, secured against my property. The loan had been taken out 2 years ago. The payments, according to the statements clipped behind the agreement, had been irregular. 2 were marked past due. I sat on the floor of Gerald's office for a long time. I thought about Gerald, who had been a careful man, a document man, a man who read everything twice and kept receipts going back 15 years. I thought about what he would have said if he had known. I thought about the $80,000 we gave Dennis and Sandra for their down payment, freely and gladly, lighthouse card and all. I thought about the surgery I had just had, 40 minutes away from my son, and the 7-minute phone call, and let him know how it went. I thought about Yolanda, who owed me nothing, and came anyway. I made 2 phone calls the next morning. The first was to my doctor, who had recommended I rest and avoid stress, and I apologized to her for ignoring that advice. The second was to a lawyer named Patricia Holloway, who had an office on Garrison Street and had been recommended to me by Ruth years ago in the context of estate planning that I had never followed through on. Patricia Holloway was a compact woman in her early 60s, with silver hair cut very short and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She listened to me describe the situation without interrupting, which I appreciated enormously. When I finished, she put her glasses on and looked at the documents I had brought and was quiet for a full minute. Then she said, "This is a secured loan against your property, and if the payments are irregular, you have a significant problem, and so does your son." She explained my options to me plainly. Because my name was on the original collateral agreement, there were steps we needed to take immediately. She also said that she wanted to discuss my estate documents comprehensively, and I said that was exactly why I was there. We met 3 times over the following 2 weeks. On the 3rd meeting, I signed a new will. I want to be accurate about what the will said, because I think it matters to say it plainly. I did not cut my children out of my life, though I understand why some people reading this might have expected me to. I am not a person who makes decisions from anger, at least not permanently. What I did was this. I removed Dennis and Renee as primary beneficiaries of the estate, which includes the house and the savings account, and Gerald's pension residuals, which together amount to somewhere between $400,000 and $450,000 depending on the market. I designated Yolanda. I called her and asked permission before I did it, and she cried, which made me cry, which made us both feel better somehow as the primary beneficiary for 20% of the estate. I designated 40% to the Clover Falls Regional School Foundation, where I had spent 34 years. The remaining 40% I placed in a small charitable trust to be administered by Patricia, with distributions going to causes Gerald cared about: the Veterans Reading Program, the County Food Bank, the library's Summer Literacy Project. Dennis and Renee will each receive a specific bequest, $25,000 and a personal letter. I wrote the letters myself, longhand, and they are sealed and held with Patricia. The letters are not angry. I want to say that clearly. They are honest, which is a different thing, and I took care with every word, the way I used to take care with my students' papers when a grade was going to be hard to receive. I wanted them to understand something about actions and consequences that no one had managed to teach them when it might have still been easy to learn. Patricia contacted Dennis about the loan situation separately. I did not need to be in the room for that conversation, and I wasn't. What I know is that the loan was eventually refinanced in his name alone, removed from my property's title, and that process took 6 weeks and required Dennis to liquidate some investments. I did not speak to Dennis during those 6 weeks. He texted me twice. I responded both times to say I was recovering well and hoped to talk soon. I was not ready to talk soon, and I think he knew that. I did speak to Renee. I called her on a Sunday afternoon in December, when the light outside was flat and the garden was dormant, and I had a cup of tea and enough energy for a long conversation. I told her what had happened, all of it, the surgery and the documents and the will and the loan. Renee was quiet in a way she rarely is. Then she said, "Mom, I should have come." Just that. No explanation, no context, no Todd and the boys and the flights. I should have come. It was the truest thing she had said to me in years, and I told her so, and then we cried together over the phone for a little while, and that was something. She came in January. She came for 5 days without Todd and without the boys, and we sat in the kitchen and talked the way we used to talk when she was young and still thought I had most of the answers. I told her things I had never said out loud about the loneliness after Gerald, about the way the house felt too big in winter, about the night before my surgery when I sat in the dark and just wanted someone to say they were coming. She listened. She didn't try to fix it or explain it, just listened. That was the right thing, and she knew it, which told me she had grown in ways I hadn't fully noticed. I told her about the will. I told her everything. I wanted her to know not as punishment, but as information, the kind of information that changes the calculus going forward, the way knowing the honest grade on a paper changes how much effort you put into the next one. She didn't argue about the will. She said, "I understand, Mom." Then she said, "Can I come back in spring?" I said yes. I said yes without qualification or condition, because that is how it should work. You show up, and the door stays open. You don't show up. The door is still open, but you have to understand what you find on the other side may have changed while you were gone. Dennis came to see me in February. He drove the 40 minutes that he had not driven in October, parked in the driveway, knocked on the door he used to walk through without knocking. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table where Gerald and I had sat for 37 years' worth of meals and arguments and Sunday mornings, and my son looked older than he had the last time I had really looked at him. He apologized. He said he had been afraid to tell me about the loan when he took it out, afraid I would say no, afraid of what that would mean, and so he had made a decision I wasn't part of, and he was sorry. He said he had no excuse for October except that he had not understood, not really, not in his body, what it cost. I told him I believed him about both things. I told him that believing someone doesn't automatically undo what they did, that forgiveness and consequences can exist in the same room without canceling each other out. He nodded at that. I think he understood. I did not tell him about the will on that visit. Patricia had advised me to let the legal documents do their work in their own time, and I agreed. What I told him was simpler. I said that I was his mother, and I loved him, and I also expected to be treated like a person who mattered, not like a house to borrow against when money got tight. He looked down at his coffee cup when I said that. He didn't argue. I took that as understanding. Spring came to Clover Falls the way it always does, reluctantly, and then suddenly, the forsythia going yellow overnight, and the garden waking up in the corner by the fence where I've had the same patch of daffodils for 20 years. Yolanda came to see the garden in April, We had been talking on the phone every couple of weeks since January. She had a grandmother she was close to who had passed the year before, and I think we filled something in each other that neither of us would have found through ordinary means. I showed her where I wanted to put the new rose bed, along the south fence where the light was best, and she said she'd come help me plant it if I showed her what to do. I said planting roses was not complicated if you were willing to get scratched a little. She said she worked in a cardiac ward and scratches didn't bother her. We bought 12 bare root roses from the nursery on Route 9 and planted them on a Saturday in May, and by July, they were doing exactly what roses do when you put them in the right place and pay attention to them. They grew. I still have days when the house is too quiet. I still have evenings when the golden window light arrives and I feel the weight of everything Gerald and I had and no longer have. I don't think that goes away. And I'm not sure I'd want it to, because wanting it to go away would mean wanting to have cared less than I did. But there is something different about those evenings now. There is the phone call I can make, to Yolanda or to Renee, to Ruth with her Thursday mysteries, to Carol who asked no questions and drove me home from the hospital. There is the rose bed coming in along the south fence. There is the knowledge, hard-won and worth every penny of the cost, that I know who shows up. Here is what I want to say to anyone who recognizes something in this story, who is nodding at something in the kitchen or on a lunch break, or lying in bed at night with the particular quiet that follows loss. You are not wrong about what you need. The loneliness is not weakness. The hurt is not ingratitude. Needing people to show up for you is not asking too much. It is asking exactly the right amount from the people who said they would. And you are allowed to make decisions that reflect what you have learned, not out of spite, not out of scorekeeping, but out of honesty, the kind that says, I have seen who appears and who doesn't, and I get to decide what I do with that information. Your love for someone can be real and your will can still be changed. Those two things are not as far apart as people want to tell you they are. The papers I signed with Patricia are in the fireproof box in Gerald's office. The letters I wrote to Dennis and Renee are with Patricia, sealed and dated and honestly written. The roses are on the south fence. Yolanda has a key to my house now, not because I gave it to her as a transaction, but because one day last autumn, she said her car had broken down and she needed somewhere to wait for the tow truck. And I said, of course, here, take this, and never asked for it back. There is a word for people who show up without being asked, without anything to gain, simply because you needed someone to show up. I taught that word for 34 years in various forms in Atticus Finch, standing when no one else would, in Sidney Carton walking to the guillotine, in every story where someone did the harder right thing instead of the easier wrong one. The word is character, and it turns out you find it in the strangest places. Sometimes in a nurse with dark braids who comes by on her day off with a paperback and a cup of soup. Sometimes in yourself, sitting in a lawyer's office 3 weeks out of open-heart surgery, finally deciding that what you built over a lifetime deserves to go somewhere it will be honored. Gerald would have approved. He was a document man, after all.